All right, well, thank you. And thank you, Evan, for that paper. That was wonderful. And he represented all of my arguments accurately to, as far as I could tell. So I appreciate that. So just as a response for a few minutes here, let's deal with what he said about Hume and my treatment of Hume at first. He said, remember, the Hume's arguments that were presented were, number one, metaphysically impossible. I see that wasn't Hume's argument, but Evan's argument, and I see that you kind of softened on that from what I saw in your works. I thought you said in your works, the OUP book from last year and also the article that you wrote for the forthcoming one seemed to say that you thought they were metaphysically impossible, and in your paper you said maybe. So have you softened on that?
Not much. I mean, I find those arguments pretty strong. I wasn't, when I initially formulated the arguments, aware of this work by John Robert Russell, which I have to say might be right.
Okay.
Right? If so, that would be very interesting.
Okay.
But I mean, these are philosophical arguments, and I'm not naive enough to think that philosophical arguments are apodictic. I could be wrong.
Okay. Okay, so on to David Hume. I talked about his balancing argument, the argument being that natural law informs us that corpses don't come back to life. We see this with an exceptionless regularity. And when you weigh that on balance against the evidence that that corpses come back to life, by, let's say, by human testimony, we see that human testimony isn't nearly as reliable as we see the regularity of natural law obtaining. So I criticize that by saying that Hume was building his foundation using the wrong parts, because we're really not considering here that it's not that natural law tells us what happens to corpses when left to themselves. We all agree that when left to themselves, corpses do not come back to life. This is what we see with an exceptionless regularity. The issue here is, the real question is, what happens if, is there sufficient evidence to suggest in the case of Jesus that his corpse was not left to itself? That's the real issue here. Well, Evan replied with 4 criticisms of my response to Hume. And these, it's fine. He was responding to my arguments within the book rather than the one that I provided here. And that's okay. That's what he had to, time and material to prepare for. I wasn't trying to trick you. It's just that in preparing for this and reading Evan's stuff, it made me rethink some of these things. And so let me deal with the 4 things he brought up. He said, I accused Hume of being too strict in his criteria for miracle testimony. And here's what I say, and I do think Hume is too strict. He says that a miracle testimony must be attested by a sufficient number of witnesses of unquestioned good sense, education, and learning, and of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of doubt. Moreover, these witnesses are to be of such a high reputation in the eyes of others, they would have much to lose if lying. Finally, he demands that the event be performed publicly in a major part of the world so that its visibility would be unavoidable. So unless all these criteria are met, we shouldn't believe in the testimony of a miracle. And yes, I do think these are too strict. I do think that they're unreasonable. We don't have this for any other thing. And when it comes to history, no historian is going to require this kind of criteria. Well, you say, well, of course, you're talking about someone rising from the dead. We're going to require something like this. Well, remember, we're not talking about a breaking of a natural law here. I don't agree with Evan's definition of miracle that it is a violation of a defeasible law. I think that the laws describe what goes on when nature is left to itself. So a miracle, the way I'm defining it, is not a violation of a law of nature. It is an occasion when nature is not left to itself. I think that we do want some decent evidence for a miracle, but I do think that Hume's criteria here is too strict. Second, I said that Hume, I'm trying to read my own handwriting here. that if Hume's argument stands, then we would have to discount a number of natural anomalies that we know to have occurred, and even the existence of dinosaurs. And I remember in preparing for this dialogue between Evan and I thought, I'm not so sure I still like that argument that I gave. So I'd have to think through it some more. It certainly wouldn't be one, it's not one of my favorites. So I'll grant you the point there, okay? Because I don't know that I like that one anymore. So you may be right there, that I'm mistaken. Let's see. His third one was about our understanding of antecedent probabilities, that our I might view antecedent probabilities different than he does, and how we're going to calculate this. We may use this differently. But remember, what I did say about Hume's argument is I do think he's using the wrong parts in constructing it. So I think he is using his antecedent probability based on what he thinks the laws of nature are, and I just don't define them in that way. So yeah, Evan is correct here that we're going to look at it differently. I just think Hume is wrong with this. I think he's using the wrong parts and building a fallacious argument. And finally, in reference to Hume, Evan talks about how there's many contenders with the Christian worldview. Now, in one of his writings, I forgot which one it is, but he calls it Demolition Derby. And that if the evidence for miracles in one religion is evidence against the Christian miracles, and evidence for the Christian miracles is evidence against those, and so they cancel each other out. I just don't see the logic behind this, because if we are to apply the same kind of logic, we could apply this to theism and atheism and say evidence for atheism is evidence against theism. And evidence for theism is evidence against atheism, and so therefore they cancel each other out, and we'd have to embrace the absurd position that God neither exists nor does not exist. And that doesn't work. So I don't see these as really undermining the case against miracles, or my refutations of his two arguments, that miracles are metaphysically impossible, and the balancing argument. I think these arguments that I provided still stand. Now, what about these this mythical genre that we're talking about? Evan says, Mike says the historical bedrock is what to be explained when we do historical investigation. And he says, no, he doesn't want to do it this way. We've got to consider the genre of the literature itself and take the literature as a whole. So I would like to do that for a moment. I don't think that is, you certainly have to take the genre into consideration. That is a first step, no question about it. I don't want to go to Revelation, the last book in the Bible, and interpret that naively in a historical sense, as perhaps LaHaye Jenkins did in the Left Behind series, as though this is referring literally to things and a rapture and all this kind of stuff. We've got to consider the genre. And my insisting on doing this is what has gotten me into trouble with people like Norman Geisler and Al Mohler, ultra-conservatives, who said, no, it's all got to be taken literally in a sense. And in fact, Geisler told a friend of mine, when this controversy broke out, he went to Geisler and he said, so Norm, tell me, the seven-headed great red dragon in Revelation 12, whose tail is going to sweep the stars of the universe down to the earth, you don't really think that's a real cosmic space monster floating out there in the cosmos, do you? And he said, well, yes, I do. Whoa. Yeah. So, that's kind of what we're looking at here. And no, I'm not an ultra-literalist like that. I agree with Evan. We have to look at genre. It's extremely important. And the Gospels, the majority of New Testament critics today regard the Gospels as ancient biographies, Greco-Roman biography. You say, well, why not Jewish biographies? Well, for some unknown reason, we don't know why, but the Jews weren't writing biographies of their sages in that day. So if they were going to write biographies of Jesus, Greco-Roman biography was the only game in town, and so we have to understand what they're meaning by this. And the flexibilities. And this is something I've been studying for the last 6 years with some just really fruitful results. If you're interested in some of these, and this explains a lot of the differences in the Gospels, I encourage you to go to my website, risenjesus.com, go under the resources section, the videos, and look for my lecture on why there are differences in the Gospels. I talk about Greco-Roman biography and the use of these, and it explains a lot of the biographical devices that the Gospel authors used. Now, in terms of specifics here, Evan provides 4. One, he says, are we looking at literal or figurative readings? And he appeals to Matthew's raised saints in Matthew 27, 52, 53. It is a strange passage where it talks about that when Jesus dies, there had been darkness, there was an earthquake, the temple veil split from top to bottom, there was an earthquake, the rocks split, the tombs were open, the dead saints were raised, and after Jesus' resurrection, they came out of their tombs and walked into Jerusalem. So I won't repeat the difficulties in this. It's not mentioned by anyone else in the New Testament. It's barely mentioned by the early church fathers. And even so, a lot of those, it's very difficult to understand how they really interpreted it. Evan says that I should look at this and see that it is heavily influenced by Hellenistic sources. Well, I do appeal to a number of the Hellenistic sources that we can see this going on. We can see it happening with the death of Julius Caesar. We can see it happening all around. But it also occurred in the Jewish sources. We see it happening in Josephus in reference to the destruction of the temple. We see it happening in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost when Peter goes back and refers to Joel chapter 2 when the young men will have visions, old men will have dreams, the sun will go dark, the stars will fall out of the sky, moon turn into blood, things like that. And he seems to, and whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And he seems to suggest that these things have happened in their presence. So this apocalyptic special effects is something that was there in both Jewish and in Hellenistic culture. So I do see this as figurative, that this happened quite occasionally in the ancient writings. Is this what's going on with Matthew? In my book, I was inclined to think so. Right now, I'm probably slightly inclined, maybe not quite as convinced as before. I've looked into it a little bit more, but I'm inclined to still think of this as apocalyptic addition that's in there. So not legend, not myth, but as a literary device, much like maybe a historian would today say, 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. We don't really mean that in a literal sense. Or if Grandma knew that Katie got pregnant at 15, she'd roll over in her grave. Well, we don't really think that, Or, the Muslim terrorists, hell will freeze over before the Muslim terrorists throw down their arms. We don't mean that in a literal sense. So Evan does ask a very pertinent question, a great question. How do we draw the line between Matthew's raised saints not being taken in a literal sense, being taken in a kind of literary figurative sense, and Jesus' resurrection? Well, I think that we can make that case that Matthew's raised saints were to be taken in this way. I can show you multiple examples in the literature, Hellenistic and Jewish literature, where precisely this kind of device is used. It's precisely when Virgil talks about the death of Julius Caesar that he mentions things like darkness, an eclipse of the sun, a comet, that Mount Etna erupted, that the stream stopped flowing, that cattle, black intestines were seen outside of cattle, that pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset. We do see this. We see that Cassius Dio reports that when, I think it was the Emperor Claudius went into Egypt, same kind of stuff happening. The gates of the temple of Jupiter opened on their own when they took many people to open. There was an eclipse of the sun. There was a comet. A woman was seen walking around with snakes in her hair. That ghosts were seen walking around. So we can show this in the literature. But when it comes to Jesus and his resurrection, we can see that the earliest Christians meant for us to understand this as a literal historical event. There is none of this kind of literary stuff going on. Paul is saying, if Jesus was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, the Christian life is not worth living. But Christ was raised, therefore we are going to be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. And this was the uniform testimony of the earliest Christians. And they defended the historicity of the resurrection event and of Jesus' death and his miracles, his resurrection. And they said they weren't telling myths, cleverly devised myths. These were things they said they were eyewitnesses to. So this is entirely different genre and claims that you have with the resurrection and with Jesus than you have with Matthew's raised saints. There is no defense of Matthew's raised saints elsewhere in the New Testament or in the early church writings.
We should probably open it up to.
All right.
I realize you have more to say,
All right.
but
No problem.
yeah. So hopefully questions will be asked. What kind of question would you like to be asked? That will
Why don't you ask me about Barabbas or the sign of
All
Jonah?
right. So I'll make a list here, and if any of you have a question about Barabbas or the sign of Jonah, so Rebecca, why don't you start?
All right, so I guess I was wondering if a story being mythical and it being literally true are somehow exclusive. So why couldn't someone say, yeah, the story's definitely like mythical in some ways, but then possibly it could be true? And I didn't take you as saying like, Evan, as it definitely wasn't true, just that there's this better mythical reading that fully explains things.
Yeah, so that's certainly something we need to think about. And I've heard this objection, right? So, okay, so maybe you're right about the, the mythical dimensions of this, but that doesn't show that it didn't happen. And, and you're right, at least theoretically, it doesn't show that. But what is true is, well, two things I want to say. One is that history, at least ordinary history, doesn't happen with these sorts of structures in it. Okay, I'm just going to assert that. You're not going to get them, like the women being placed exactly where they need to be placed and all that. So I think where you want to go is to say that somehow or other God choreographed all of this, all right? I'll say, fine. So you've got a hypothesis now, I've got a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that some very intelligent people who had a serious message to convey were able to, use this symbol system in quite powerful ways. You need a God who says, okay, so I want this guy Barabbas, to be there and yada, yada, right? So got to look around in ancient Judea for Mr. and Mrs. Barabbas. Hopefully can find them. Make sure that they have a kid at the right time. Make sure that he gets the name Yeshua. Make sure that this kid grows up and gets in trouble with the law and gets arrested by the Roman authorities at the right time and happens to be in the clinker there and happens to be the one that gets grabbed by the guards. And you can take all that on board. All I'm going to say to you is your probabilities go down. And my probabilities stay way up here. So divine micromanaging is something you have to accept.
Thanks. I wish all the Christians I knew read the Bible as deeply as you've been reading it. All right, so I have a few questions, but I'm going to limit it to this. Namely, give you the invitation to talk about Sign of Jonah and Barabbas. But also I wanted to say that I think you made a misstep there in your response to Evan about the demolition derby bit, because it seems to me the standard move when, so for example, I've seen Paul Draper make this move, say, okay, there's considerations for theism and considerations for atheism, and what that means is you're left with agnosticism, and it's not like a contradictory position or anything like that. I mean, that's how lots of people who would be inclined to be atheists do argue for kind of principled agnosticism. So I don't think your reply to Evan on that point works.
Let me answer that. And you can follow up on this, but I don't think my answer was offline with that, because if if miracle claims in other religions, or evidence for miracles in other religions, is evidence against the miracle claims of Christianity, and miracles, the evidence for the miracles of Christianity is evidence against miracles, and they cancel each other out, the evidence for one cancels out evidence for the other, then that would mean that evidence for theism cancels out atheism. It would mean that evidence for atheism cancels out theism. And therefore, you're not left with agnosticism, you're left nowhere, because you can't be a theist. You have to say theism isn't true, and you have to say atheism isn't true, because you're saying the claims of the Christian miracles isn't true, and the claims of the miracles in the other religion isn't true. Unless you're just going to say, well, then these are evidence, the evidences themselves are canceled out, and we're left in a neutral position with these, then I guess you could say you're left with an agnosticism.
Maybe one distinction that would be helpful here would be between rebutting and undercutting defeaters. So with an undercutting defeater, this would be like you have a belief that the object is red, but then you notice that the light shining on it is red or whatnot, right? So the canceling out could be like the removal of positive grounds, or of sufficient positive grounds for either hypothesis, rather than gaining positive evidence that both are false, right? Which seems to be what you might be thinking right now. But I'm also interested in hearing what you had to say about the sign of Jonah and Barabbas.
Well, I guess I would also say too then, when we are left with that and the canceling out and things, then you would look at, I think the way out of this, the solution is to acknowledge that not all miracle claims are equal in their evidence. There are some miracle claims that have a lot better evidence for them. And when you look at the miracle claims for Jesus performing miracles, it's a lot better than what you have for like Apollonius of Tyana. In terms of Barabbas, Barabbas was someone who was arrested for murder in the insurrection. Now, at the beginning of the 2nd century, there was a guy named Simon ben Cosima, and they nicknamed him Bar Kokhba, the son of the star, because he was a messianic figure. So how could it be possible here that when it comes to Barabbas, son of the father, that this was a nickname given? Jesus, as Evan mentioned, was a very popular name. It was one of the 7 most popular male Jewish names in late antiquity, in Jesus' day. So in fact, you'll find that there's only like a dozen names, and almost everybody was named those. In fact, one of every 4 women in that day in Palestine was named Mary. So you're going to find this stuff. And so you have, like Jesus, son of Joseph, or Jesus, son of, so forth. So, I mean, even within the 12 disciples, you got two Simons and 2 Judases. So to find the name Jesus was very common. You could have a guy named Jesus who was involved in the insurrection and was a messianic figure, and so they named him son of the father, Barabbas. That's definitely a possibility. In terms of this Yom Kippur, I've heard this from Richard Carrier before, and it just amazes me because Yom Kippur, you've got these 2 goats, and one is led outside the city and let free, whereas the other is slaughtered in the city. And that's where Yom Kippur comes in and all the symbolism behind it. But in the case of Barabbas, he was released inside the city. Jesus is marched outside and slaughtered. So if you're going to take this as Yom Kippur, you've screwed up all the details in it. You lose all the symbolism because everything's in reverse there. It loses its symbolic significance. In terms of the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights, I discuss this in my book, and I show how what we are looking at here is a temporal figure of speech. It's in the book of Esther, where Esther tells others, her uncle said, hey, go and tell the people to fast and pray for 3 days and 3 nights, and after that I will go in to the king and petition him. And it says, so they did as she commanded, and on the 3rd day she went into the king. Well, that's, so it seems like a temporal figure speech. I think what really gives it away is Matthew, because Matthew is the only one that has the sign of Jonah being 3 days and 3 nights. Well, later on in Matthew, after Jesus has risen from the dead in Matthew 28, the Jewish leaders come to Pilate and they said, we remember when that deceiver was alive. He said that he would be raised after 3 days. So give us a guard until the third day. So it's not 3 days, 3 nights at that point. Just give us a guard until the third day. Well, that means they're going to pull the guard away at the very time they need that guard most, because Jesus is going to be raised afterward. They wanted it so the disciples wouldn't steal his body. So this seems pretty clear to me that we're looking at a temporal figure of speech, just like saying, hey, wait a minute, that'll just take a second. No, that'll take forever. You know, that's a temporal figure of speech. And even in the Akkadian medical literature, the 3-day motif was used to simply mean a short period of time. One other thing I would point out is the 1.5 day that Evan referred to. That is the woman who's anointing Jesus 2 days prior to Passover, but it probably wasn't right there in the morning or whatever. So you could get the 1.5 days, as he suggests. The problem is that John has it as 6 days. I think John changes the day for a reason. And you have Luke, who, if he's reporting the same event, he displaces it and puts it in an entirely different context. So they don't see this kind of significance there. They use it for different literary reasons. And then again, we've got Paul, who writes decades before the Gospels are written, and he mentions the resurrection as a real event that occurred in history, and that the truth of Christianity is based on it. So I don't think the Gospels are doing this, but that's something Evan's going to have to take. And how do you explain Paul? That's going to be really difficult for him.
I think I can. I think I have, actually, in the book.
Okay, let's hear it.
But there's a whole lot of stuff here. Do I get to? Let me just, I mean, there's a ton of stuff. Mike worries about the fact that Jesus gets sacrificed outside the city and Barabbas gets released inside the city. And that's interesting and significant. Joachim Jeremias points out that early Christians, I'm not sure exactly how early, take the Jewish lore according to which the axis mundi that goes from the heavens down into Sheol and runs right through the temple, the middle of the temple, the altar there. And they move it to Golgotha. So you have a new Jerusalem that's outside the old Jerusalem. And I take the release of Barabbas to the mob, in fact, to have the following symbolic significance. These people who were citizens or are citizens of the old Jerusalem aren't going to be citizens anymore. They're the wilderness now. So it's precisely the symbolism that is quite intentional, I think, and says something that coheres with the rest of the story that I want to tell about what's going on symbolically here. So I'm happy to take that on board. On the question of the whether Paul means the resurrection literally or not, there's a lot more than I can say here about that. But I'll say just one thing that ought to give one a little bit of pause. Well, two things. One is, of course, Paul thinks that it is of ultimate existential importance to Christians whether Jesus was raised from the dead. Of course he thinks that. The question is, what does he think that means? And he does say, right in the middle of 1 Corinthians 15, it's around verse 30, I think, I die every day. I die every day. Did he mean that literally? Or not? And if not, what did he mean by it? That's worth thinking about. On the 3 days and 3 nights, this again is a long discussion, okay? Yeah, but I guess I'll say this. So Remember that his opponents have asked him for a sign. He says, this is it. This is the sign. I find it hard to imagine that he's going to be sloppy. And it is the one place where the chronology is exact, 3 days and 3 nights. I don't think that's a throwaway line. If you read the book of Jonah, surely there it means 3 days and 3 nights. It's not just a figure of speech. And he makes explicit reference to the sign of Jonah. I find it contextually odd to suppose that Jesus was just being sort of off the cuff with respect to the temporal markers that he is offering his opponents. He surely wants them to be able, when the time comes, to recognize his prophecy as one that was clearly true.
So can I push back on that a little bit?
Sure.
Like Paul, when he says, I die daily, I think that he is saying there that he's facing death daily because he's being persecuted left and right.
As he dies.
Right. And obviously, he's not meaning that in a literal sense, right?
I agree.
So, but he does talk all over in his writings about being persecuted and being whipped, imprisonment, at the point of death and left for dead when he was stoned at Lystra.
Not every day.
Not every day, but I mean, I told you a million times not to exaggerate, every day. We use exaggerations like that all the time. I think we see this Jesus using it. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Unless you hate your father, mother, brother, sister, you can't be my disciple. And sometimes
You think that's exaggeration?
I do. I think it's hyperbolic language. Matthew redacts Jesus saying that. Jesus is reported as saying that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Matthew redacts it where he says, unless you love me more than father, mother, brother, sister, life itself, you cannot be my disciple. Matthew redacts Jesus saying several times. He does it with divorce, puts the exclusion clause for immorality. You're right that in Jonah it does seem to be a literal 3 days and 3 nights. But a lot of times with prophecy, they would interpret prophecy and apply it in a different sense. So, for example, when Paul and Peter, they will say that Jesus' resurrection was a fulfillment of Psalm 2:7. You are my son, today I have begotten you. Well, in Psalm 2:7, that's referring to David. I have chosen you and installed you as king at this point, given birth to you as king. But in the sense of applying to resurrection of Jesus, it's not saying that he created Jesus. It's because you are my son, I have given life to you via your resurrection. So the New Testament authors did this frequently where they would take an Old Testament text and they would apply it to Jesus, but they would apply it to him in a different sense than was meant in the Old Testament. And it could be that maybe Luke provides with the sign of Jonah. He says, no sign will be given to this generation except the sign of Jonah, and doesn't even list the 3 days, 3 nights. Could be that Matthew's just redacting Jesus saying there and adding the 3 days, 3 nights to mean a short period of time because he knew the 3-day thing was there. I'll be raised on the 3rd day. So he could have been doing it for that reason. I don't see that that means myth.
There's a large methodological issue here, which, again, I wish we had time to discuss, and we don't, and that is, what do we want to say about the differences between the Gospels? Let me just say this much, that I don't hold Luke responsible for what Matthew said or vice versa. Each of these guys, I think, is trying to forge a highly integrated, very carefully narrated story. They are trying to convey essentially the same message, but with important differences in the messages as well. They don't fully agree with one another, I think, in the underlying message either. And so I think we have to take that into account. With respect to Matthew 10:36, Jesus says, do not think that I have come to bring peace. I come to bring not peace, but the sword, to set father against son, and mother against daughter, and then there's daughter-in-law and son-in-law in there, right? That's not Irenic language. No way. And in fact, it's been a perennial thorn in the side of Christians, right? Now, I've got certainly have a story to tell about why that's there. And it's quite on purpose. And it is not Irenic. And it plays a critical role in the message, I think. And it's there in one form or another, not just in Luke 14 and Matthew 10, but in about a dozen different passages spread out across all of the Gospels.
I just had a question, Evan, about your argument for the metaphysical impossibility of miracles. So if I understand it, sort of the core premise was that if there were a miracle, that would mean that there would be a violation of Newton's third law. And so I guess I don't understand how it's supposed to go from there, because it looks like you can only infer the metaphysical impossibility of miracles from there if we have reason to think that it's metaphysically impossible that there be violations of Newton's third law.
Thank you, thank you.
And yeah, I take it the standard view in philosophy of science is that even the fundamental laws of nature are, while nomologically necessary, metaphysically contingent. And there are people who think otherwise, but it seems it has the mark of metaphysical contingency. We can conceive of it having exceptions and so.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I need an extra premise, which I think is true. But let me just say parenthetically that Mike suggested that my view is that a miracle is a violation of a defeasible law. No, the whole point is that if the law is defeasible, it can be defeated without being violated, right? So, I mean, that's I'm afraid, a misunderstanding of defeasibility. But I do think, and again, this is metaphysics, right? So I clearly could be wrong. I do think, and this is critical to the claim, that laws of nature are grounded in metaphysically necessary second-order relations between universals. That's my view. And I am taking on board that. You know, I've got to defend that. There may be other views according to which, actually there are some other views according to which laws of nature are metaphysically necessary. If there is a weaker necessity than that, some people think nomological necessity is somehow weaker. I've seen sort of strange views there. I don't know what I would want to say about whether God can override nomological necessity. I think, and I think theists ought to think, that God can't do what's metaphysically impossible. You pay a big price if you don't buy that. Right? You're dead right.
Evan, I'd like to ask you something. So you're saying you could be wrong, all right? We know that miracles are either metaphysically possible or they're metaphysically impossible.
You do know that.
And so you're saying you think they're metaphysically impossible, but you could be wrong. So, all right, I presented 3 extraordinary answers to prayer. Let's just take that last one of the atheist who told the story about the annuity to the exact dollar that came the exact day of the all-night prayer meeting. And so it seems to me that you get enough of these things, you'd say, all right, I got these 2 views. This is the one I hold, but I could be wrong. Experience over here does seem to refute this. So I should go with this one to say that they are metaphysically possible. So how do you explain those 3 extraordinary answers to prayer I mentioned earlier?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you an answer you don't like. You won't like. But first, I want to say quantity doesn't trump quality. That's, by his own admission, the problem with at least almost all of the miracle reports that Keener relates in his book. He says, as he must, that these have not really been properly investigated. And we just have an extraordinary track record of what look like awfully clear cases of miracles which, when they are carefully investigated, the stories fall apart. It's true, by the way, also of out-of-body experiences where people claim to be able to travel around. You can do quite simple controlled experiments to see whether they can really see things that they wouldn't be able to see if they weren't able to leave their bodies. And you know what? It turns out they can't see those things. Very simple experiments. So I'm suspicious. I'm not closed-minded about this, but I am suspicious. And so the mere fact that there are lots of these stories, that's not news. The question is, in what cases do we have the right kind of carefully controlled conditions under which we can determine what happened? The part of my answer you're not going to be happy with is I'm going to not give you explanations for your stories. I have students that come to me on occasion with stuff like that. I say, what do you think about this? I say, I don't know. I wasn't there, right? I mean, how can I possibly claim to know? Because there are a zillion ways
But
that
Evan,
the
in
thing
your,
might be fleshed out.
in your book, you said the kind of evidence that you would need would be something like if the stars had this formation of many, many, and that
Many,
thing-
many Tekla Parson.
Yeah, and had it in there, and then they flashed on and off, and then this happened several nights in a row. Well, then you would, really consider things.
I wouldn't consider things. I'd become a theist, just like that.
But it
So
seems to me
the
you
story
couldn't.
is, it's a starry night. I like looking at the stars. I actually do get weird feelings about how big that all is. And before my very eyes, they rearrange themselves into many, many Tekla Parson. I go, oh my God, what? And then they do it in different languages, right? Different Chinese language and all that, different nights. I mean, the first thing I'm going to think is, what did my kids put in my dinner, right? But then, after a sleepless night, I run out to the local newsstand, and there's the New York Times with screaming headlines, right? And the astrophysicists are in a complete uproar. Well, that does it for me.
Why? Because you think miracles are
can't.
metaphysically impossible, and on balance, these natural laws would say that can't happen, and that would go against testimony. And you can have hallucinations.
I told you, I think it's likely that they're metaphysically impossible. I could be wrong. This would be damn good evidence that I was wrong. But Keener's stories are not.
Well, Keener, though, he says the reason why a lot of his stories aren't investigated like he would like to is, like the case of the child who was bitten by the snake and died, stopped breathing for about 6 hours, and then upon prayer, boom, the kid comes back to life, because you couldn't have an EKG set up to the kid to measure,
It's
the
not their
heart.
fault.
Yeah.
It isn't their fault. It's just that the fact of the matter is we don't have the right kind of controls.
Yes, Tony, sorry.
Actually, my question's already asked.
Really?
I'm still a bit confused about your demolition, about your response to Professor Feld's demolition. Maybe you want to say more about it, or we can.
I'm probably just not understanding what the objection is. Maybe I'm misunderstanding his objection or argument, and I'm answering something that he's not arguing.
Okay, well,
so.
maybe I misunderstood you. Are you saying that the demolition argument doesn't work because if evidence from each side cancels each other's out, then you have a contradiction of truth value? Is that what you're saying? That two things can't be true, atheism and theism at the same time, and when the evidence contradicts and they cancel each other out, that's what you end up with?
What I mean is, if we're going to say that evidence for one cancels out the other, and evidence for that other cancels out, if evidence for A cancels out B, and evidence for B cancels out A, then you have to reject both. Maybe that's not what you're arguing. And maybe you're arguing that it just eliminates the evidence. But even in that sense, it would be, you just have to consider the quality of the evidence, because not all evidence is created equal. the evidence for some things are far better than they are for others.
In the book, I mean, so there are a couple things. One is, one task that Hume undertakes in part 2 of Miracles, maybe doesn't succeed, but he tries to give us reasons for thinking that to a very significant extent, the quality of the evidence is going to be roughly the same across all of these cultures, because what accounts for the evidence is certain very general features of the way people behave and the things they say. Right. Now, I mean, I don't think he's fully successful in clinching the argument there. There could certainly be differences in the quality of the evidence. That's true. The general form of the argument I try to lay out in some detail in my chapter on miracles. And it's roughly, the idea is this, that there are a lot of different religions, and they may overlap in their doctrinal commitments, but they often conflict. And if you have miracle stories that are at home in these different religions, and the miracles over here are offered in support of some doctrine A, right? And you've got a religion over here with a doctrine that's not A, and it's got a pile of miracles in support of not A. Then the fact that the two doctrines are in conflict, and the fact that these miracles are evidence for this and those miracles are evidence for that, entails, this is Hume's claim, that you have conflicting evidences. In effect, you've got evidence for A and you've got evidence for not A. And at least to the extent that you know, the miracle stories are roughly on a par in terms of the grounds we have for believing them, you get a kind of cancellation effect. Hume says you have to subtract one from the other. And the fact that we have not just two opposing religions, but tons of opposing religions means that nobody gets a very big part of the probability space as a result of that. The upshot is you should be agnostic.
So that makes two assumptions, though, it
Yeah.
seems.
The evidence is a wash.
So it makes the assumption that all the miracle claims are of equal evidence.
No, I didn't make that assumption.
No, you didn't do it, but I'm saying the way you posited the argument of Hume doing it there, that would assume that they're all of equal evidence and quality. And it also would assume that they're connected to that particular event. So let's just take Islam and Christianity. So Christianity says you have Jesus claiming to be the divine Son of God, and Islam says, no, he's not. Christianity has the miracle of the resurrection to support it, and you can kind of tie that to Jesus' claims. I mean, he's making these claims, and they challenge him, and he says, I'll give you one sign, my resurrection. So, you know, if he rises from the dead, if he claimed to be divine, we should probably believe him. So Islam says Jesus is not divine, and what miracle do they have for that? The miracle of the Quran. And the Quran says, well, just try to create a surah like it, you'll find that you can't. So, I mean, I think you can create a surah like one in the Quran very easily, even something better than what we find in the Quran. So the quality of the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus is far superior to what we have for the evidence for Islam. Yeah.
All I think Hume is committed to is that you have to subtract the one from the other. They might or might not be equal. If they're equal, then you get 0. If
I
they're
might
not,
go with that.
then somebody wins, right? Maybe, but they win by less than they otherwise would have won. Yeah, you know, so you know, you have two prophets. One says A, the other says B. Both of them are alleged to perform miracles. And if the miracle stories are sort of equally well supported, and the miracles are just as great miracles. I mean, you know, in the Bible you have people competing to see who can do the best miracle. Moses versus the Pharaoh's guys. You know, the Pharaoh's guys do pretty well, by the way. I think you ought to worry about that. Right? The only thing they can't do is make the gnats.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. So, Evan, I'm just kind of curious on, perhaps might call it your hermeneutical methodology. And so it seems as though, you know, you're interpreting the resurrection and the resurrection narratives in this figurative sense. But it also seems as though the majority of Christians today, at least in my seem to interpret these literally. And in fact, it seems as though, just kind of on my read of church history, that the majority interpretation of these narratives have been a literal interpretation, and that these interpretations even go back pretty early on, like in the apostolic period, apostolic fathers, the early patristics, and what have you. So I was kind of wondering at what point you think, like when and why did the interpretation so dramatically shift from the original figurative interpretation to more like a literal interpretation of the resurrection?
Right, right. Clearly a question I have to worry about, and also equally clearly a question I couldn't hope to give a real answer to without having a mastery, not only, God help me, of first century Judean history, but the entire history of Western civilization. So I'm going to sort of beg off and offer it to you as a research project. I'll say a couple of things. I'm very interested. Tim Paul knows this. I'm very interested in the early fathers, especially the ante-Nicene patristics. You know, these huge debates about stuff that really puzzles us, the Trinity and the two natures of Christ and so on. That ontology stuff I was telling you about, I think I can make perfectly good sense out of those doctrines. But it's an interesting historical question whether the early church fathers were using that kind of conceptual framework in thinking about these things. I'd love to know, but it would require me to spend some serious time reading the patristics. There are, Richard Carrier has mentioned this to me, certainly passages you can find in the early church fathers that are awfully hard to read as anything but assuming a literal death and resurrection. This bothers me. This is counter evidence to my view. You either have to say that this was a sort of an exoteric doctrine, something that was put out there for people who wouldn't really be in the know, for which there is some evidence, or that people started taking this stuff, some people anyway, started taking this stuff fairly literally, fairly early on. You know, there's debates about what happens if a cannibal eats your body after you die, and, you know, and then they convert to Christianity and they're going to, yeah, so, I mean, that's hard to make sense of unless there's either a specific dialectical political context, which I suspect there was, by the way. I mean, I think there is some evidence for that. They're trying to answer pagan arguments of a certain kind. Or you have to worry about your question. As for the general question, though, which is a deeply important question, when did the general shift occur, which would have moved from a really political understanding of this stuff to what is our more modern Christian typical view? I do have a few things to say about that. I don't think it's by the time of Eusebius, who thought clearly enough that Constantine was the parousia. He says so, practically. But not long after that, with Augustine, you get the city of God. And that is, I think, a quite conscious, deliberate effort to get a divorce going for political reasons at the time. Rome was clearly thought of as the eternal city. It's clear that Christians thought that. And now Rome has been sacked by the Visigoths, and the pagans were making sport of the Christian claim that once the eternal empire had been created, it would be there forever. And Augustine needs to do something to defend Christianity against that challenge. That's only one of a series of really fundamental watershed moments, I think, that have moved the narrative away from what it originally meant.
The problem I see with that is Paul. Paul is our earliest source. Paul is preaching what the Jerusalem apostles are preaching, and Paul is teaching that the resurrection actually occurred, and the truth of Christianity and our eternal life, our afterlife, is contingent on whether he actually rose from the dead. So Augustine's late. We go back, you can't get earlier than Paul.
No,
And yet
but
he's viewing the resurrection as an actual historical event.
that's your reading of Paul. That's
How
not,
else do you
that's
read
not
it?
my reading of
How
Paul.
do you read him differently?
Well, as you know, Richard Carrier doesn't think that he's talking about a mortal human being,
That
okay?
he-
And
right,
Carrier
he's
is
got a
no
different
slouch.
body. No, but he's
Carrier's
got poor
no-
exegesis there, and I
Well,
mentioned it in the book, and
Say you.
well, so does Dan Wallace. He said if Carrier had been in his Greek class, he would have failed him.
I can't read Greek, right? I warned you guys that I'm not a scholar. But I can tell a story about Paul that doesn't require me to suppose that he thought that this was history. That is to say, I can give you reasons on the basis of what little historical evidence we have for thinking that Paul was situated in such a way that he found this kind of language to be a powerful way to communicate a message that was an important, powerful message. And
We'll go a little bit over our time, so we can get a couple more questions in. And I've got Steve, Lorraine, Josh, and Mike. I think we'll get Steve and Lorraine in, and maybe Josh.
But by the way, just one other thing about the Carrier thing. Carrier doesn't say that Paul didn't think that Jesus actually rose, if I remember correctly. Carrier just disputes on 1 Corinthians 15 when it says it is sown a physical body, it's raised a spiritual body, it's sown in corruptible, it's raised incorruptible. He's not seeing continuity between those. He thinks it's a totally, there's no continuity between what's sown and what's raised. And what I criticize Carrier on is he's got his Greek wrong there because there is continuity. The Greek shows continuity. But I don't think Carrier, Carrier and I may disagree, and I'd like Rick, all right? I just think his Greek's wrong here, but we disagree on what Paul was saying in terms of the continuity of Jesus' resurrection body with his earthly body. But you have to correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Rick would say Paul is not saying that Jesus wasn't really raised, that it wasn't a real event.
yes, he would say that. But I mean, you may be right.
Well, no,
Against-
you have to be right there
Oh,
because
no.
Carrier denies that Jesus even existed. So of course he would have to be saying that Paul doesn't really mean that.
But the dispute you were having with Carrier, I think Carrier was trying to discuss what Paul meant by his talk about the general resurrection. Okay, not Jesus's resurrection specifically.
All right.
So I mean those are details maybe we don't
Yeah.
need to worry about right now, but I'll be glad to talk further about it.
Evan, as you know, in the Bible, there are a lot of prayers, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And a lot of them are public prayers, like with Josiah and Solomon and so forth. And I think it's easy to take those public prayers and to sort of leverage those into your hermeneutic that claims that these prayers were made were really ways of supporting a certain polis or commonwealth or culture or something. I wonder if it bothers you that there are also private prayers where it's a lot harder to leverage those into your hermeneutic. I just don't see.
You bet it bothers me.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, because
yeah,
there's no way that a polis or a commonwealth or anything like that or a political entity is a person, so it couldn't answer a private prayer. Okay.
Yeah, and so I mean, there are a lot of things here. I mean, it's one thing if the story says that somebody said a private prayer, because of course now the story is public, right? It's also true, I think, and has always been recognized as true by people that the interior stuff, the private stuff, is an important part of one's formation as a good citizen. So, I mean, I'm not sure that this is right? But I mean, there are a number of interesting possibilities here, but you're right, absolutely. I worry about that.
So I guess I had just a comment and then a question, a clarification question. So when we're dealing with interpreting a text, we've got issues at the interface of semantics and pragmatics. And so a lot of difficulties arise there with the fact that, or due to the fact that much of what we communicate, even when we're speaking literally, goes beyond and maybe even conflicts a lot of times with the semantic content of our words. So my son falls and scrapes his knee, and I say to him, "You're not going to die," right? It's not really a metaphor. I'm speaking literally, but if you just looked at the semantic content of what I said, it looks like, somebody could take that out of context and say, "Oh, she just declared her son immortal." Well, no, that's not really what I meant. What I meant is, well, you're not going to die from that, but it's sort of incomplete. And so I think when we're looking at a text that's as old as, the New Testament, it's, to me, not at all implausible that a lot of the words that Jesus speaks can't just be taken purely at face value. Like, even when he's speaking literally, there's going to be a lot of interpretation that goes into it, and that how to interpret that properly, you have to know the intention of the speaker, you have to know a lot about the context, you have to have a lot of background knowledge. And so I just think, to me then, it seems really relevant how the earliest people who were reading and interpreting the text interpreted it, and seeing what they said about it, because they're the people who are closest to the context and have as much of the relevant background knowledge as they would need. And so, I think that should weigh heavily, if the early fathers have a certain interpretation, I think that should weigh more heavily than, how we interpret it later. Or if we try to interpret things out of context without looking at the tradition of interpretation, I think, we're going to be in trouble because of how much those pragmatic factors
Yeah, I
play in.
absolutely. I don't disagree with anything that you said. I mean, I don't think mere proximity is a guarantee, right? Partly because even people that are very close to the events can have access to grind of one kind or another, or can have blinders on of one kind or another. So it's not a guarantee. But I mean, that's why, if I had another 50 years to live, I'd be burying myself in the patristics, and I really do want to, find out what those guys did have to say. I do know that Eusebius seems to have had exactly the sort of view I think somebody ought to have if they read the scriptures the way I read them. But I know not anywhere near enough to say very much more than that about. But the other thing is, though, that when you read these texts, I think you do have to read holistically and contextually. I suppose everybody agrees with that, right? You want to know what's there beyond the words on the page. You really have to have a general theory of how everything hangs together here.
Sorry, I just had a quick question.
Well, I was going to let Josh. Go. Okay, Josh is out.
Oh, no. Sorry, I just wanted to ask about the point you brought up about, Professor Fales, about the saints who rose from the dead before Christ rose and appeared to many. I wasn't sure exactly what the problem with that was. Is the problem just that that's really weird? Or it seemed at one point you mentioned that there was a problem that was a resurrection that occurred before Jesus' resurrection? Was that the problem, that there was a resurrection event before? Because then I was going to say, what about the resurrection of Lazarus or the widow's son who was raised?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's not clear from the text whether the resurrection of the saints is to be assimilated to the Lazarus kind of case. And, they're going to live for a while and then die again, right? Or whether it's to be assimilated to the Jesus kind of case. I'm inclined to think the latter, but the text doesn't give us enough, really, as far as I can tell, to go on there. And it matters which it is. I was being half in jest, but not entirely in jest, in the suggestion that the reason that it says that they rose when Jesus died, but they didn't actually get out of the tombs before he was resurrected, may be connected to the 1 Corinthians 15:23 passage. That's a speculation, but maybe not a crazy speculation about, why it's that way. But I think, and Mike thinks, that it would be really weird to think that this was a literal historical report of something that happened. And Josephus is completely silent about it. It would have been banner headlines in the Jerusalem Daily News the next day. I mean, and then there's no further mention of them even in Matthew. At all. Nothing.
Yeah, the problem you do have is if they are raised in a resurrection body, then that does contradict Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:20, who says Christ is the first fruits, meaning the first to be raised with a resurrection body. So then that does leave you. Matthew is writing after Paul, of course. So that does leave you, if Matthew's not contradicting Paul, then they're raised in a Lazarus-type body, but now they're raised at Jesus' death. They don't come out of their tombs until Easter morning, so they haven't eaten for at least 40 hours. They're homeless. They need food. They need shelter.
Do they have clothes?